Hello, welcome to the conversation on News Central Television. This is the program where we bring you up to speed with all the political happenings on the African continent. I am Gbenga Aborowa.
And I am Rita Omodia. Now, today on the program, we will be looking at improved relations between Kenya and South Africa as both countries have agreed to a mutual visa-free system. This comes as both presidents met in Kenya and also discussed ways to improve trades and policies that will benefit both countries.
Also on the program today, we will be looking at Tunisia as the leader of the Islamist party and vocal critic of President Kais Saied, Rachid Ghannouchi, has appeared before court on grounds of money laundering and incitement to violence. The case and other officials involved are also being prosecuted for alleged suspicious financial transactions with a firm, I beg your pardon, called Interlingo.
Well, I think the situations in Tunisia are not coming to an end anytime soon. We've seen the president suspending parliament, the prime minister.
He's got more powers, and Tunisia's been out of the news for a long time, but the person of Rachid Ghannouchi is a force to reckon with when it comes to Tunisian politics, and is like the lone voice of the opposition, because the President Kais Saied is a lot of people have described him as a democratic dictator, but it would be nice to see how that plays out.
Definitely, we'd like to see how that plays out. And right now, we'll move to our first topic, where it's good news for holders of the Kenyan passport, as they will now be allowed to enter South Africa visa-free from January for a maximum of 90 days annually. Now, President Cyril Ramaphosa made this announcement on Wednesday during an official visit to Nairobi. President Ramaphosa and William Ruto held bilateral talks which explored areas of mutual interest and collaboration and resolved a long-standing visa dispute. The new agreement, which is set to take effect on January 1, was announced during the first official trip of South African President Cyril Ramaphosa to Kenya on Wednesday.
Meanwhile, President Ramaphosa and his Kenyan counterpart, President William Ruto, also directed their trade ministers to address barriers that limit trade between the two countries, which are amongst the strongest economies in Africa. The duo also praised the Ethiopia peace agreement signed last week in South Africa, brokered by the African Union.
On behalf of the people of Kenya, I express Kenya's appreciation on the progress we have made in the long-awaited visa-free regime between Kenya and South Africa. From January 1, Your Excellency, we will have a different regime. Kenyans holding ordinary passports will be allowed to enter South Africa on a visa-free regime for up to 90 days per calendar year. Kenya and South Africa recognize climate change as a definitive challenge of our time. We reiterate the implementation of the national determined contributions, including adaptation and mitigation efforts and delivery of finance as agreed in COP27.
We also, during our discussions, focus on several issues affecting our beloved continent, including the situation in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, as well as Western Sahara. We agree on the need for peace and stability in our continent and the ending of conflicts within and between states.
Now, join us to discuss this new visa-free regime for Kenyans traveling to South Africa is Arnold Maliba, a public policy analyst. He joins us from the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. And we also have Hermon Berhane. Ogbamichael is the head of a program and lecturer for journalism at Peninsula University in Cape Town, South Africa. Gentlemen, a warm welcome to you both, and thanks for joining us on the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
I'd like to start with Arnold in Nairobi. Now, Arnold, how did this deal come about? Because when you look at the relationship of Kenya and South Africa, one would see this as a surprise, because it's not all countries, especially if you don't belong to the economic group, that have visa-free regimes. Did you see this coming as a surprise. And how receptive are Kenyans to this? What's the mood in the country?
Actually, it's not entirely a surprise because this is a process that started a little bit earlier under President Uhuru, who just left power the other day. You remember that President Uhuru had visited South Africa, and this has always been an agenda every time Kenya engages South Africa, because for the longest time, South Africa has always actually blamed Kenya for being a conduit of the illegal immigrants, specifically from Ethiopia and Somalia, who end up in South Africa.
Yes.
So that question has always been a dodgy one, but entirely it's not it's not a surprise in that President Uhuru Kenyatta it was actually at an advanced level by the time President Uhuru Kenyatta left.
Okay, now, Hermon, you are in South Africa. I mean, how have the people of South Africa reacted to this? I know South Africa is dealing with a whole lot of issues, talking about load shedding, unemployment. We see a lot of protests going on from the labor union. So with the news that Kenyans can now have a visa-free access to South Africa, how are they reacting to this?
Actually, this is something that is very commendable from both presidents, President Cyril Ramaphosa and President William Ruto. As Arnold stated, that it has always been an agenda, it has always been an issue. So it can't be also one-sided where South Africans can go visa-free and enter Kenya, and where Kenyans have to be charged or they have to be asked for a return ticket, or they have to show their financial means to enter South Africa. So this is, I think, a good step ahead. There might be some concerns from, of course, from South Africa. I mean, it can be maybe some assumptions where security concerns or other illegal migrants can use Kenya as a route to enter South Africa, but it should not be seen that way. Actually, we have to see it from an African point of view, from a Pan-Africanist point of view. If European Union, 26 countries can make this reality, I don't see actually why Africa is actually delaying this all, making visa restrictions for some countries. So I think this is...
I'm happy you mentioned the European Union, Hermon, because you'll be surprised to know that holders of EU passports find it easier to travel within Africa than Africans themselves. And this is coming on the heels of Operation Dudula and growing anti-immigrant sentiments in South Africa. So how do you reconcile the two? Just last week, Operation Dudula members were looking at the South African Premier Soccer League and saying, you know what, they should limit the amount of foreign players that play for them, and and this is coming. So how do you find the situation? How would the South African authorities make sure that the Kenyans that are visiting would not spend more than 90 days, so it wouldn't inflame a more anti-immigrant sentiment?
Well, they have to train their personnel. They have to put their facilities in order to control that the people do not actually stay beyond 90 days. So if they put their systems in place, there is nothing wrong. I mean, nothing would happen actually from what I see. So it's all about putting all the system loopholes trying to close all these loopholes and then monitor people that they return on time. But if people, we cannot say that people may not stay beyond 90 days. It might happen, but there is always a law. People are also taken to court and they get penalized for staying beyond 90 days. So there must be some legal means to address it, but it's all about putting the system loopholes, not allowing actually people to stay beyond those 90 days. So that should not be any lame excuse not actually to make these agreements that they made both countries to happen. And they need also to see the bigger picture. We might address it later. The trade and investment that can be promoted from both sides.
Yeah.
Both sides are big economies in Africa. I mean, Kenya has a GDP of 110 billion or more, and South Africa over 420 billion GDP, and almost they have the same population, so they can explore more opportunities.
Okay.
We'll
go deeper into that in a moment, but I want to bring in Arnold into all this. And you mentioned something quite valuable, and that is South Africans already had free visas on arrival in Kenya, while Kenyans were charged and required to provide proof of sufficient funds and return flight tickets. So, Arnold, what were the issues prior to this truce, and why was it formally one-sided?
I think for the longest time, South Africa has literally made it so difficult for the other people on the continent. For example, it's easier for us in Kenya to go to Dubai, to go to Europe. It's actually much easier for a Kenyan to go to Europe than it's been for a Kenyan to actually go down south. And like I mentioned earlier on, the argument or the claim behind those was always that illegal immigrants, specifically from Ethiopia, which is actually the highest number, and Somalis would use Nairobi being a regional hub to then sneak to South Africa. So that was used as an excuse for the longest time. But then even the current system is not as easy as it looks out there. You know, when politicians come out to make pronouncements, they make it look so easy. But then the truth is that still Kenyans will need an invite when going to South Africa. Besides having an invitation, you must actually also have a return ticket. And then, of course, the proof for yellow fever, COVID-19. And if you're going there as a tourist, of course, within that particular time, you must also give proof that you have got financial ability to stay there during that time. So the system in and of itself is actually sufficient. It will be very difficult for anyone, of course, to abuse it. It's also possible that you can pay a return ticket, demonstrate that you'll come back home and still run away. So the issue, I think, cuts across that most African countries, like you mentioned earlier on, a lot of Europeans, literally every European can go to any African country and get a visa. Sometimes it's visa-free for a lot of Europeans. But for us in Africa, it's difficult for us to go around. Just even within East Africa, if you're going to Tanzania, you are going to Burundi, you are going to DRC. Of course, we used to have challenges until the EAC, the East African community, worked around that. But we still have got challenges. So it's easier for people who do not come from Africa to move around Africa and do business. But Africans cannot do business across the continent, even with their neighboring countries. There are cases, for example, where people have to fly to France to get back to Africa just to transition. That's how difficult it's been. And I don't think that it's not the best way to go about doing this. And the next frontier in the challenge is actually having at least a common language. You know, for most of Africa, for most of Eastern and South Africa, the common language, or a lot of those groups are Bantus. They speak languages that are almost intelligible to each other. For example, I am a Bantu from Western Kenya. And when I worked for the Mail and Guardian in South Africa, literally the Zulu that they speak is almost 30% my language. Whatever they mean on the other side is the same thing. For example, the Zulus will call a leopard ingwe. It's the same word. There's no, even in diction, it's not different. So there's been talk about having one language across Africa, that is Swahili, because it's a language that almost fuses in a majority of the languages in Eastern and Southern Africa. So we still have got some space, and or rather, we still have got quite a distance to cover. But Africa needs to lose up. Whatever has happened between Kenya and South Africa, it should be made easier, and then we should open up to each other, because that's the only way we are going to fast-track trade and even integration.
Thank you very much, Arnold. I'd like to bring in Hermon here. Now, Hermon, following up from what Arnold said, we need to stop paying lip service to African integration. Africa signed the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement last year. It was hailed as a landmark signing, but a lot of countries have not ratified, and it's not implemented yet. It's almost lip service. And it did mention that some people, when you look at air travel within the continent, some people have to fly to Portugal to get a connecting flight to Angola. So we pride ourselves from the Organization of African Unity to African Union, and we're just paying lip service to this. So what barriers are stopping Africans from freed movement of people and trade as written in the AfTA agreement? It's such a fantastic document, but the devil is in the detail and implementation. What's stopping Africa from being united?
I see there is a lack of commitment from leaders and the lack of commitment from the African Union itself. I was told by some people who work for the African Union that they even stopped conversation about African unity. If you remember, the late President Muammar Gaddafi was one of the proponents of one Africa, one passport. Even he was going to the extent that we must have a common currency, a joint military, and so on and so forth. But that was a threat to the Westerners. They see it as a threat, but that is a long discussion that we can have on that. So I see that the African Union even stops talking about African unity. They are just meeting and talking, and as you said, giving lip services to Africans. As we know also, they are being funded by the European Union and by some other Western governments, and they seem that they are only executing or implementing what the directives that come from their funders, instead of actually asking for membership fee and depending on internal resources. Gaddafi was one of the leaders who was funding African Union, because if you are funded by the externals in the West, then of course, then
he who feeds you controls you. Now, Hermon, when they meet in Addis Ababa a few times in the year, do they not discuss these issues?
They do. They do discuss about it. There was a time that they wanted to start actually giving an African passport. They would start with the public officials in any country. So I don't know what is making them to lag behind on that matter. So there is no commitment, but there is a conversation all the time. There is a conversation about trade between African countries, but you can't have trade when there are visa restrictions. You can't have trade when one country is thinking that we are the best and the other African country is seen as the worst. You know, yes, we understand that there are wars and conflicts in some of our countries. There are security matters. There are migration issues. But those could have been superseded if there was a political will and a commitment to actually go for this, removing the restrictions and people traveling within borders. I mean, if we,
Yeah, thank you, Arnold. Thank you, Hermon, rather. Now, Arnold, we've mentioned two barriers now, which is language barriers. You also talk about political commitment and political will. Now, one of Nigeria's ministers talked about insurgency, the fears of allowing free movement of people in the Sahel region. Now, is that really a barrier for the free movement of people across Africa, insurgency or insecurity around the region or around the African continent?
Definitely, security is a key issue, and you can't actually overemphasize that. It's still a challenge. Like you will realize that the Somalia corridor would actually spur a lot of growth. They've got a big, the biggest coastline in Africa. Even if you wanted to go to Djibouti, you wanted to have any entry on the other side of the Red Sea, you're still in Africa, but then you have to use a longer route. You sometimes have to go to Saudi Arabia and then have through before you come back to that. And so the issue of insurgency and insecurity is a big one. On the other side, on the same point, you will actually realize that then, especially where it is intra-countries, you then find that countries don't trust each other. I'll give you an example closer home here, that The border between Kenya and Somalia is actually quite a difficult one to manage because we have got Al-Shabaab on the other side. So Somalia on the other side and Kenya on this end actually it becomes quite difficult for people to move across. The same thing, of course, happens between DRC and Rwanda, Uganda and the DRC because of M23 and the ADF. So it's quite a common challenge around here. And sometimes when they operate from both sides of the border, it makes it difficult for countries to allow free movement of people for obvious reasons that countries didn't want to defend their sovereignty and local security at home. So it's true. It's, of course, a serious issue that insecurity and insurgencies sometimes they actually are threatening to some regimes in some certain countries. And once it gets to regime survival, then of course people throw out sense. Even the Pan-Africanism we're talking about is not even considered as much because then the regimes in those particular countries have to fight for survival.
Now, quick one, stay with you, Arnold. Still talking about how to integrate Africa. If you look at a country like the United Arab Emirates, they have one of the most lax visa regimes in the world, quite open, literally open to anyone in the world. So how, as a country like the UAE, been able to accept people from different parts of the world with little to less scrutiny than some African countries or Europe? I remember I visited Malawi earlier this year and I had to get a visa. I needed to apply for a visa. So how did the Emiratis do it in a way that people still don't overstay or commit crimes or make their country unbearable, and they still manage to keep their country safe?
The UAE, of course, is quite a different case altogether. You might not be in a position to use one brush to actually paint it out. Of course, there's still challenges of crime in UAE. There's still cases of people overstaying, but not to a level where they are not able to manage. Of course, the incidents you actually mentioned do happen, yes, but it's manageable.
Yes.
First of all, of course, UAE has got very strict laws. Not a lot of people really want to go to UAE unless it's actually necessary. You're either going for work, you're going for business. Not a lot of people want to get there. And those who actually are found on the wrong side we actually have got cases where people don't love being on that particular end. But then now, flipping it to the African side, you'll realize one thing. The biggest problem we have is these boundaries that were drawn in Berlin in 1800, I think, 1880s, 1890s. The boundaries were drawn. There was no participation from our side. Of course, when the colonialists exited Africa, we took up those particular boundaries and we owned them more than them that actually drew them. So there is lack of political goodwill on our side. There is a deliberate unhealthy competition, what I would call unhealthy competition between countries in Africa, forgetting that if one country grows, automatically there is a spillover effect, and then you can't do everything within one jurisdiction. So you find that we've got some small countries that are not viable. If they were businesses, they are not viable. That's why a lot of countries in Africa depend on debt, foreign debt, that is, and they have to come up with sometimes extreme taxation regimes and means to try and stay afloat. So for me, largely is, of course, the effect of colonialism. Of course, people will say that 50 years for most of Africa since the colonialists left, we shouldn't be talking about that. But it takes just about 25 to 50 years to totally destroy a culture. So colonialism is still an issue. We cannot ignore that. Number two, of course, neo-colonialism, of course, being a bounce off from colonialism, and unhealthy competition, lack of political goodwill. And then dependence on the other parts of the world. China, for example, is the world's factory. And as China becomes affluent, the world needs a new factory. That new factory is most likely supposed to be Africa. But then the countries that we have sometimes do not have the sufficient human resources to even take up some of those businesses and opportunities.
So they only take out raw materials
until we break down
here.
These borders, it's going to be very difficult for us to move.
Okay, now looking at growth, because you talk about the economy and all that and the colonialism, I'm going to go back to Hermon on this because you mentioned this. And that is one of the major factors that a lot of people have been talking about, the economic benefits of this visa-free policy. So for South Africa, what are the benefits for it?
Well, in terms of tourism, for example, Kenya has a very attractive tourism infrastructure. And Kenya gets so much tourists from all over the world. So for these tourists can be redirected also to South Africa because South Africa also one of the biggest economies in South Africa is also tourism. So this is just one example. And there can be also even other cultural exchange because when there is conversation, then there is exposure. Also for South Africans, it's good if they also go out and expose themselves what's going on in Kenya and also elsewhere. So it has some sort of benefit in terms of integrating the both societies, also in terms of other opportunities. People will open their eyes. There are also South Africans who might want to invest in Kenya. So this is an eye-opener in all aspects in terms of economic cooperation and in terms of what South Africa also can provide in terms of skills transfer, even also Kenya. There are so many educated Kenyans where also I know here who are contributing in terms of their skills. So we can see it in a broader way.
Thank you, Hermon. And Arnold, just before we wrap things up, Kenya is East Africa's economic powerhouse, and it's been growing in influence, especially in its neighborhood. You have Kenya recently accepted the DRC as a member of the East African Community. And Kenya's immediate past president, President Uhuru Kenyatta, also was influential in mediation efforts to end to bring about the cessation of hostilities in Tigray. My question is this, looking at the future and looking at this new visa regime arrangement with the Republic of South Africa, is Kenya looking to expand its influence and footprint on the African continent? What's Kenya's foreign policy direction when it comes to Africa?
The problem with that question is that it's the very reason why we have got so many countries raising up walls for people to go across, especially when you speak about countries having influences across borders. Then for a lot of African states and people, the nationalistic approach for them becomes a big issue in that people do not want to lose their nationalism or to lose, quote unquote, to any other country's influence. But yes, for me, opening up Nairobi and Johannesburg or Pretoria, people being able to go across, for me, it actually opens up one of the trade highways in that Kenya is one of those economic power hubs in Africa, especially on the eastern coast of Africa. Then South Africa on the other side, of course, is the big man, or rather the big boy of the continent. So if we can open up, and if this particular one can actually open up for the other countries so that we are able to make the movement of people and goods across Africa much easier, first of all is that once you influence trade, the livelihoods of our people are improved. South Africa has got a lot of things that Kenya can benefit from. One of the challenges, by the way, that we've not mentioned is that South African businesses have not always fared well in Kenya. And one of the reasons that was actually blamed was that we didn't have a very good relationship. So every time South African businesses would be here, or rather come to set shop in Nairobi, somehow after 2-3 years, then they close shop. The same has been happening for Nairobi-based businesses. A good example is that Kenya's telecom giant Safaricom tried to actually push the M-Pesa product, the money transfer product, being the first one in the world actually at that particular point before it spread everywhere. In South Africa, it's really not made a lot of progress. even though the mother company, or rather part of Safaricom's ownership is South African. So that has been a challenge. I'm looking forward to a time where businesses in South Africa can actually come to Nairobi and prosper. The same thing, the things that Nairobi, for example, I have got friends in South Africa who've tried to actually set up coffee, to actually export coffee from Nairobi to Johannesburg and try to put up model coffee businesses like it is in Nairobi. But it's not been easy because there's been a lot of roadblocks. So away from the visa, there are other roadblocks that need to be done away with to ensure that people of these two countries actually benefit from this particular arrangement. It's just beyond the visa. We still have got a lot of economic hurdles, administrative policy and legal frameworks that really need to be reviewed before people enjoy this. And of course, the same could be replicated across Africa. And in the long run, of course, we hope that one day Africa is going to be actually one country where we've always been one country anyway. We've never been different. Those boundaries are actually imaginarily drawn in the pencil.
Okay, Arnold, I'd like to stay with you for a while now, and that's talking about William Ruto. I know that this meeting between Ramaphosa and William Ruto is coming on the sidelines of a peace agreement between Ethiopia and Tigray. But at the same time, William Ruto is, I don't know, I think barely 100 days in office. Can we put that as a plus on him, or has this arrangement been before William Ruto even became president?
Of course, in politics, whatever you do, even if somebody has been working on it, you actually take the credit. So whereas this particular process has been on for a while, you would remember or you would recall that the former president, President Uhuru Kenyatta, had gone to South Africa. They had already initiated this particular process, and they were in talks for quite a while. It's been a lengthy process before we got here. So it falls on William Ruto's watch to actually take credit, but the work has been, the long and hard fighting for this particular product has been on for years. So it's good for him. Of course, he's also reaping a little bit of what you say, fruits from other people's labor. But for politics, you take credit when it's actually your watch, including the peace agreement that was signed in South Africa, of course, mediated partly by Olusegun from Nigeria, and of course, our former president, Uhuru Kenyatta. So for William Ruto, I think literally he's not even set up his government because ministers, principal secretaries, and part of government are still being vetted according to law. So he is not really in office fully because he's not even fully instituted his government, but he's already reaping and actually making strides. We only hope that once he's fully in office, then we will see much more.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Like they always say, government is a continuum, so he can take the credit for that. I'd like to say a big thank you to you, Arnold Maliba, public policy analyst, joining from Nairobi, Kenya, and Hermon Berhane Ogbamichael, head of program and lecturer in journalism at Cape Peninsula University in South Africa. We do appreciate your time, your insights, and your contribution to the program. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're watching The Conversation on News Central Television. We'll go on a quick break, and when we return, we'll be looking at situations in Tunisia, where the opposition party leader, the Islamist Ennahda Party, Rachid Ghannouchi, is facing trial over money laundering and terrorism financing. We'll get into that shortly. Please stay with us.